Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann Rabke, and my beloved Carl Rabke. We don't have the luxury of living in ordinary times, but rather we live in extraordinary ones where the way we live in the next decade will make a huge difference in the future of life on planet Earth. We aspire in this tapestry of rich conversations drawn from a variety of wise perspectives to share resources to help you embody the wisdom, compassion, and skillful actions that are needed during these times. You can find out more about our classes and sign up for our newsletter at embodimentmatters.com. You can also become a supporting member of our podcast with a small monthly donation. Look for Embodiment Matters at patreon.com.
Greetings, listener friends. In this episode, I had the great pleasure of speaking with Liam Bowler. And Liam is a teacher, writer, bodyworker, and host of the Body Awake podcast. And most recently, he wrote The Creator's Companion, which is a beautiful little book exploring the whole process of creativity. So we begin the conversation speaking about embodiment and embodiment as relationship and embodiment as process, and also reflecting on how each of our understandings of embodiment have evolved and shifted over the years. And we spend a good amount of the conversation in this terrain of looking at creativity and elements from Liam's recent book, and just exploring how each of us comes to this world as this unique creative expression, and what it means to become oneself, what it means to find your own voice, and how we can be more supportive of ourselves in the creative process. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. You can find more about Liam's classes and writings at thebodyawake.com. All right. Well, welcome, Liam. I'm so glad to be here with you in conversation again.
Thanks, Carl. I feel the same.
So I think, as you know, one of the places we love to jump into these conversations is just exploring this word of embodiment. And for you, in this moment of your life right now, how would you describe what embodiment is, what it points to for you?
Yeah, maybe a couple answers from me, and one maybe leading some into what we're talking to, but because I was thinking about that this morning, about what embodiment means to me, and I don't know any word that doesn't derive at least some, if not most, of its meaning from the context that it's used in. So syntactically, the context of the sentence and the paragraph, and however many sort of the larger layers of like, what do we actually mean? And again, I imagine we'll talk about this, but I think that's a really good thing to examine for most of us, especially the more well-known, celebrated, often a word with so much sort of incoming power, maybe like embodiment is sort of, I wouldn't even degrade it to say buzzword, but like something that so many of us are like, yeah, what's that? Can also, in that same breath, I think really important to just say, well, how's this person using it? What's it mean here? What's the vibe of it here? So that's my politician answer, and but just as real. But yeah, I was also feeling like, for me, I think the most gravity that I feel around that word is something around the kind of things that happen to us over time, the kind of maturing that takes time. I think when we talk about a teacher who like embodies her teachings, it could be a very young person. I suppose it doesn't need to exist in time necessarily, but just that kind of maturity that it's reached their cells. And my sense is often not in a way that we've pulled it in, like, I'm going to get more embodied this weekend. We can almost take a load off, like it'll happen. don't sweat that so much. It happens over time. And maybe a better question is just, well, what am I embodying? Almost like not the opposite of, but a different phenomenon than insight. Insight is like, holy shit, here's the nature of the universe. And
yeah.
that can be incredible, but embodiment happens over time, and it's maybe less of a flash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you were saying, describing that, I was having this image of like a slow moving underground stream or something,
Right.
it's like consistent, steady.
Yeah. That maybe sort of has a life or agenda of its own, where I don't know, but my experience very much is like, I find out what I'm embodying. I find out what this life is, what my role is in it, not as a flash of insight. I mean, I've had those, but what feels more true is the sort of embodiment that happens as it reveals itself to me. Where I'm oriented now is so different than I was a few years ago. And I mean, call that, I guess we don't need to necessarily call that embodiment, call that what you will, but I feel like that's the kind of pulse that for me, that word has the most sort of meaning, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to a technique or something.
Yeah, I really get that. And just I know for myself, like initially embodiment felt like a kind of inside job of like, oh, I need to work with my posture or my balance or my movement. And in the last decade or so, it's really shifted to more of that entanglement, more of that like mycelial connection that we're embodied in relationship. And
Yeah,
I think
me too.
that's really important.
Yeah, I don't quite know where that shift happened, but very much me too. It used to mean a lot more sort of what I'm feeling, yeah, I mean, you just said it. And yeah, I've also found that like now it's sort of, its significance is in, maybe that's where something happens, but the significance of, um, I won't say any kind of embodied practice, but for me, is like, its only significance is in relationship, which shows up all sorts of ways. But I mean, yeah, just the real day-to-day human, plant, animal, all of that, but especially human relationships.
Yeah, because they're the ones who can choose not to do it, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Just the ones that can push buttons that a tree can't, for me.
Yeah. Well, I would love to talk. I have this great copy of your book in my hand, A Creator's Companion, which I just find to be such a beautiful, almost like oracular book of I love just randomly opening pages and see like, oh, what's the invitation or the prompt that wants to come today. So I would love it, Liam, if you would just speak to how did this Creator's Companion get planted? How did it come to be, like talking about the process and maybe what was an intention for you of writing this book?
Yeah. Thanks, Carl. I just say oracular. That's a great word. I'm gonna pick it up too. I think there's something about, yeah, holding, and there is an e-copy, and even an audiobook, but I have for this work in particular, a particular fondness for the printed form. This book arose for me out of a huge shift in my life, which was becoming a father, the birth of my son. And I mean, the implications of that, I think any parent, I don't know about any parent, most parents I've talked to will say, yeah, it was a real radical turning point. And I mean, I feel very, very much aligned with that sentiment. It was a huge, huge, huge shift in every orientation I can imagine in my life. And I would go on walks with my son, and I would leave my phone. Sometimes I'd bring my phone, but I learned he slept better. And I would often sing. I hadn't sang like that in years. And we'd go around and I would sing just sounds, but often sort of the three notes, just sort of looping, or a few notes. And really beautiful. I'm just kind of like fondly thinking back on all that. But a lot of space. I guess that's what I'm trying to create with my words here. There was a lot of space, in some way a blank slate, not like, wow, I could do anything, but almost like, no, for once in my life, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to tend to this guy. So that sort of singularity, it kind of arose out of that, as an idea that came and went and came and went. And I've done a lot of creating, of making stuff in my life, a lot of classes, I mean, thousands of hours of planning and teaching classes. And yeah, a bit of an examination of that process and kind of what remained after, good ideas, bad ideas. I would drink a cup of coffee and have great ideas, and then the next day I'd feel bad about myself and the ideas would seem like crap, and all the comings and goings, but just a sense that there was some, what's called the creative impulse. Not creative like I need to wear fancy clothes and do something no one's ever seen, but creative like making dinner, like having a moment in a conversation where you don't know what to say and don't necessarily rush back to what you think you should say or should do, those creative tension moments. Like, I guess that's what I'm talking about. Looking at that process, and not what do I think, what sounds good, what positions me in this cool way, but just like, what do I know? Not as some ultimate truth, but just in my everyday subjective experience. Like, what do I know to be true? And so it really started as and ended as that question written down, answers to that question.
Yeah. There's so much, that's so many directions we can go with this. But
Yeah.
The one word that comes up as I was listening to you is just this, like, this quality of courtship, this sort of like, when I have read your book, it feels like that, like ways of courting the muse or courting your own creative style. And it's not like here are the 6 steps to creativity, but it's more like, oh, here are ways that you're in a consistent relationship with many aspects of the creative process, not maybe what we tend to identify as the creative process.
Yeah, that's great. I love that word too, courtship. And what I think this is true for a lot of folks, but for me, I think was a very lost art. One that in many ways I'm just finding a new relationship with, and being in a long-term partnership with my, with my child, obviously, and child's mama, and the way we're doing this dance that I haven't really ever had to do in my life. It's a beautiful word, right? Because courtship isn't just being like, you're mine, dragging somebody off.
Yeah.
But it's also not just sitting back and going, okay, whatever you want to do. It's like, I love you. I'm devoted to you. How do I do this? It's fun.
Yeah. There's a beautiful story that Francis Weller often tells about when Mary Oliver came to do a poetry reading in the Bay Area, and someone asked her, like, how do you see the world like this? Like, how do you show up with such wonder in walking around a pond or walking on the beach? And her response was, I keep the appointment. and just like, even saying it now, like I get goosebumps of like this way of, she shows up every morning, and there's a sense, because I think with creativity, there's often this, there's this balance between the passion aspect and the discipline aspect. And there's something of that keeping of the appointment that is, it's not just, well, whatever unfolds, but like there's a real diligence and consistency and receptivity involved.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I know for me, it's been so, I think important, even as an understatement, sort of everything, to find, I'm going to pause on this word because I'm not sure what to call it, but to continuously, not as an event, but to sort of, I'm reminded, I don't even know who said it, but there's a quote in Zen, the most important thing is to find the most important thing. which can sound, and to me at different points has sounded very sort of like, oh, interesting, where you sort of keep looping in on yourself and you're like, I get it. But that real like aliveness, maybe that could be the most important thing, is to find the aliveness that someone else's words are never, they can spark that, right? Or you might feel like exactly the same. But I guess I'm saying all this to say, and it's interesting how I find anyone else's answer, can be, oh, so do I do you're talking about that balance between discipline and kind of letting things be. And that's such a sweet conversation. In some ways, I find that, like, if I get oriented to that question in a way where I'm like, well, which one is it? Or what's the right balance? Like, already, and here's the phenomenon, maybe I was hoping to kind of illuminate in these pages. And already before, I'm looking for an answer, but I like feel my whole internal posture, it's somewhere else. It's saying, it's that sort of, hey, what's right? What do I do? Which one's right? Which one's okay? Like, how do I be the person who, fill in the blank, doesn't experience pain, who gets it right, who gets applauded by my parents and my friends? And that's the implicit, subtext. And to kind of like the art of maybe stepping back into, feels like too active a verb, but into our own kind of direct experience, like almost before that question exists about which one of these is it?
Yeah. I know my understanding of that quote, it was from Suzuki Roshi, the most important, because I always thought for a while it felt like it was a destination to arrive at, and I really felt like I had arrived there, like probably
right.
at that.
I know what the most important thing is now.
Height of my like Buddhist fundamentalist days, I was like, oh, this is the most important thing, and I'm doing it. But
right.
to really get kind of like we were talking about with sort of evolution of our understanding of embodiment, that most important thing also has to be a call and response with life, and has to be a call and response with context. Like, what is the most important thing right now? And what is the most important thing with the world as it is right now, with these particular challenges that weren't the same as they were a decade ago or 20 years ago?
Yeah, totally. And that living response, right? Almost that, maybe back to our original word, that sort of embodied response, maybe in this case meaning the thing that is happening before I decide whether I like it or not, or whether it should be happening. But just like if you see someone you love in danger, like the embodied response is to rush for it before you're like, well, is this safe for me or them? Or, and who knows, it might not mean you run out into running traffic. It might, but there's that, that most important thing makes itself known in those moments of intensity, maybe more directly. And a lot of the rest of the time, we're like, well, is this, what should I do? Is this going to work out for me?
Yeah.
Fair enough questions, but.
Yeah. I'm interested if, say, someone's listening and they have the sense of like, well, I'm not an artist. I'm not a musician. Like, I'm not a very creative person. Like, how would you respond in light of your book, or just your sense of creativity around that?
Yeah. I think if someone's listening, I'd be curious to ask for them, not just in some sort of rote way, but like really maybe first question, what's this about for you? And, you don't need to spend 40 years in a cave contemplating that, but often we're like, yeah, I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. Just taking a moment, even like steeping in that why, and there may be lots of layers to it. Often I find underneath, for myself and for people I talk to, there's a kind of inherent implicit directionality of some sort of love. So the sort of love that might emerge, the sort of primal act of creation, of wanting to, why did I want to do this painting? You don't have to have a good reason, right? So, but again, maybe just that sort of body sense of like, there's an impulse to create. You don't even need to say those words, but being in touch with that. And what I love about that is no one can touch that. That's not something that I remember in letters to a was it Letters to a Young Poet, the ones that Rilke wrote to the young poet, and the young poet writes like, no one's reading my work, and I'm trying to get my poems out in the world, but it's so hard, like, how do you do it? And Rilke says, in so many words, like, do not do that. Like, you just, with a sort of ferocity, like, you be a poet if you like can't not be a poet, if you like put into the world what must come through you. And then the critics, people loving you, people hating you, like, it really doesn't matter. And sure, it's nice to be loved and not nice to be hated. So maybe taking that same sentiment, but remove the word poetry, and just like, for you, listener, what, if anything, if there is that, well, I want to create, but I don't know, kind of like getting beneath the rippling waves of like, can I do it? Can I not do it? And I mean, one way of posing the question is, you get out of the way, and we're just going to ask, what wants to be born through you? Not what do you want to bring into the world, but what wants to be born through you? And you'll find out right now. You didn't know last week. You didn't know a minute ago. You ask now, what wants to be born through you? And the answer is only for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's like, it brings me to this concept of choice, because there's that sense of like, oh, you're free to choose whoever you want to be on
Mm-hmm.
one level that's held. And then there is that kind of discipline to like the actual freedom that comes with being who you were meant to be, like
Mm-hmm.
what that, like in that William Stafford poem of the thread, like what is the thread, what is the unique genius that only you can bring to the world, and
Yeah.
how different that is from, oh, I could choose to do this or this or this or this.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I have found so important and soothing to remember in that journey. I think, maybe I'll say something different about this in 10 years. And I'm curious your take on it. But it's so important, like, but you don't define that. You don't get to step out and be like, or like, I better know how to say this, or like, oh, I'm a person who da 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 da, helps people in this way. And it can be a great way to speak, but almost, it can be paralyzing too, of like, well, I don't know what my genius is. I just want to do this drawing or write some post, or like, but like, that's the alive thing. Follow that. And then your genius you'll live it, you'll be it, you'll embody it, it'll reveal itself to you along with everybody else. And it might look mundane, and it might look really wonderful or terrible. I remember, this is a little off subject, but I remember reading there's a book of questions. I think that's just what it was called. And I was a young boy at my friend Nick's house. I don't know, maybe 10 years old. But I was so interested in these questions. And they were questions like, if you could go to paradise right now for 10 years and come back to this moment with no memory of it, would you? Some of those sort of like innocuous, just fun to think about. Well, maybe I just did. But one of them was, would you like do all these great works in the world if no one knew about it? That was the first question, and it's like, yeah, totally. But it's like, what if everyone thought you were a total a-hole? That would be the choice you could make. You could do this like beautiful gift for all of humanity, but no one would know. And in fact, everyone would think you were a total jerk. And that one still like gives me a little chills, or, makes me positive, like, yeah, what am I orienting to without being like, I need to not seek from other people, but just that sort of, yeah, what is informing what I do? What's informing what I create?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a big question, because I think anyone who's really stepping in, and you have a passage on finding your own voice, which I think is such an important open question. What does it mean to find, to inhabit, to embody, to speak your own voice? And anyone who's genuinely doing that, there'll be some pushback from the world. There'll be ways of challenging that or denying that.
Yeah. God, and that seems like a really beautiful, important dance, right? That I totally feel in the middle end of, like, because you'd want to listen, right? If 10 of your closest friends were like, Carl, you're being a total jerk right now, right? It wouldn't be like, well, I'm following the truth. I mean, maybe it would be, right? But like, how do you relate to that?
Yeah.
And yet, well, I have, this is maybe dramatic examples, right? But it seems more important now than ever that, things are obviously very polarized, and also a voice can get out there so easily. And there's just all these conversations about who's the idiot, and mix in then subjects of like implicit racism, systemic racism, right? Where like, you're a fish in water that you can't see. So, hey, Mr. Follow Your Bliss, like you're doing all kinds of things that you have no idea, right? So the kind of willingness and openness to listen and also follow what vitality is coming through you. You are also fish in water, and you can't see certain things, and whatever you want to say about that. God bless you. Keep living your life and keep the soft ear and like, right?
Yeah. There's so much about that too. There's another passage I love that I feel is connected to this, where you talk about turning toward desire in a creative process, and I'd love to hear you talk about that. As sometimes desire is kind of maligned, or how does desire fit in, and then how does desire fit in the context of this world with waters of systemic racism and climate collapse looming? Like, where does desire fit?
It seems to me that, I don't know about the language, but certainly a language of life, desire. There's a real simple meditation that we could all do right now. If you want to feel embodied desire, just pay attention to your breathing, right? And there's never a moment of like, this equilibrium breath, right? The breath is constantly turning into something else because you have too much oxygen, quote unquote, too much. So you desire to exhale, and then, hold your breath for more than a few seconds, and you'll feel this fierce desire also to inhale. And in that way, that's probably a fairly innocuous example, because it's like, yeah, that's a good desire to follow, right? Don't suppress that one. But yeah, that if, in some lineages, I think at least in circles I run in, these are becoming much less popular. The ones that say desire isn't, or sorry, yeah, we need to sort of suppress our desires so that we can ascend to some heavenly realm. There's a lot of sort of modern pushback against that, feels to me like, yeah, good reason. I don't want to suppress the body, the downward soul level journey. And at least I've found it's an incomplete statement to say, oh, great, then yeah, follow your every desire. Whatever you want is, you are God, and yet so you wanting that. So, live out your wildest fantasies. Or maybe the addendum I would add to that is, go ahead in that direction, but pay attention, because I've found that, I've been to some of like I think we're getting a little off track from creation, but some wild party, and there's all sorts of wonderful things happening, and inside I'm deeply unstable and anxious. I've been there, and not like, oh, I'm in the wrong place, but just like, okay, I've got all this stuff and I'm not happy. I feel just some fundamental disconnect. And so maybe to loop back, like the sort of, I think finding that the pulse of that vitality as it presents itself here and now, maybe there's ways that can get a little wonky, but I find that vitality, it's not just like some hot coal that I'm chasing around. It's like, seems to be really inclusive. I guess that's what I want to say about it. In my experience, that finding the vitality is very inclusive, and it's not, you shut up over there if you have a dissenting opinion because I'm following the vitality. It's like that dissenting voice is part of it. That person coming up and saying, hey, you really hurt me, when you wrote this, or like, hey, I need you to see this. Like listening to that with a full heart is part of it. Like that's included in the vitality that I'm following or am.
Yeah, yeah. I'm reminded of Bill Plotkin uses that term of, becoming an adult is finding your unique ecological niche, like you find yourself in that unique way that you're embedded both in human culture and more than human culture. And that there is an eroticism to that, that there's a pulse or a forward movement to becoming in that. And that also feels like a part of the creative process, that sort of erotic, generative, like something's being born out of that place of origin, whether it's a class or an idea or a painting or a song you're singing to the trees in the canyon or something like that. That there is
Yeah.
that there's a quality of desire in that life wants to unfold in that way.
Yeah. I was gonna say, thank you. I'd sort of forgotten where we had started that question. And yeah, I very much agree. And that says it beautifully, the sort of movement of life with no particular destination. Like it doesn't care. That seems to be the game, right? It's like, I think really fun games out in the world, like you desire to win because that's what makes it fun. And, I'm not saying all of life is this slap happy. I know it isn't, but just imagine you're playing soccer or something, that for me, the great joy of those sports is like you really try hard to win and you remember it's just a game at the same time. You like get lost in it. And it's easier in something like soccer than it, maybe out in the world. But yeah, that desire is what makes you run for the ball. It's what has you moving forward.
Yeah. So I want to ask about, because I know both of us have been podcasting for a while in this realm of embodiment, and you had your Body Awake podcast, and I'd love to just ask what sort of things have evolved in your understanding through different conversations, and we talked about this a little earlier about evolving sense of embodiment, but like where do you see things going in this interesting field, over the next years or decades?
In some ways, if embodiment is a field, I'm less aware of what's happening out there than I ever have been, since being a body worker. I've been doing that for about 12 years. Yeah, certainly since I started the show, my interests, my orientation has changed a lot. Like one example of that being when I took a structural integration, certification course over a year from Anatomy Trains and Tom Myers School. I was so into that. I remember being like so into it, and I just like, not even like everyone needs this. I didn't feel religious about it as much as just like, oh, I get it. Wow, this is so impactful. And then I flew to Maine, like, I don't know, a few years ago now, but not that long ago, and long after I'd taken this SI training, and I was in the middle of some transitions. I'd just been back to Montana. It's like a 10-day training, and I remember, like, I think it was Tom Myers who gets up in front of the class and starts talking about something. And within about 5 seconds, I was like, oh my God, I don't care about this at all. I think I like stood up, was just kind of pacing a little bit and, listening and taking it in, but like, okay, I can either go home or just, what the hell, give myself to this. But it was a real interesting experience because I hadn't realized then how much things had changed. For me until like we started talking about the adductors and the connection to and I was like, oh God, this used to be so alive for me and it's so not.
Yeah.
So I don't know, or all that to say too, just acknowledging how my own, because there may be, 100,000 people who are so into that structural thing. Not to say then, therefore, in 5 years, you'll be just like me, this is the next evolution. But, we probably all have our real different alivenesses and things we're following. And mine lately is much more, a little less, or even a lot less interference, more tending to what's arising, just generally. But yeah, in terms of like a direct sensation, a heat or an anxiety or something like that, like the art, and I will emphasize that, the art of tending to that, not the card that says just pay attention to your body, because that can go all kinds of places, but the art, the wisdom, the embodied teachings from many lineages and generations, and about how to be with what comes up, especially discomfort.
Yeah. I find it fascinating. I've had similar, both in the Feldenkrais world and in the structural integration world, like what I would geek out over at certain points. I still find interesting, but that even within those, and I'd say any of those modalities are kind of meant to have widening circles of understanding, that it's, I remember Feldenkrais saying, like, you're not going to do my method. You're going to find your own handwriting with this. And it's a sort of pedagogy of how to learn and how to pay attention that then grows into, again, another expression of your unique voice. It was interesting. I was on a podcast over the summer, and a woman was asking about Rolfing structural integration work and the relationship. She's like, some people have called it like a colonizing practice. Like, why do you have to shape the body into this way? And I was really reflecting, and I've been sitting with this sense of how I find it just the opposite of like ways of how do we return to our kind of innate natural animal body that isn't as conditioned by our own habits and patterns that we've developed, and even more so by the cultural waters that we're swimming in, and how that manifests in patterns of breath or attention or how we're holding our neck. And like, that's one of those ways that the understanding has really shifted from like what the angle of the sacrum is to like how do you access what feels like your natural, uncontrived sense of embodiment.
Yeah, and helping other people do that too. Yeah. If I may, and just reflecting on what you'd asked about the the podcast and its evolving show, and I've been struck by, like, I've listened to a few of y'all's shows lately, and like really soaking it in. And it's funny because then every once in a while this thing will come up like, oh, I should interview this person, I should do that. And feeling it's so obvious, and not to poo-poo or shame that, but just it's obvious in those moments, at least, where that is coming from in me, the sort of source of that. So I could go to all sorts of plans and I could do it, and reach out. But there's often that like, well, I need to be the one in the spotlight. I need to be the one who's getting that. And that's sort of in the same breath. It's almost like this house of cards that comes up and then just is introduced into a billowing wind that, gets blown away almost right away. But that for me speaks to maybe that example of like, the why, not some head scratching thing, but just feeling, because I felt, oh yeah, I have an audience and I have a following and I need to be doing these interviews more, like that'll come up. But it's also just as obvious to me, like, I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I can name the things I'm doing right now, but it's not like something is immediately taking its place, but it's just not that. The energy is not there. There's a memory of that, and there's a sense of that, and there's no disregarding that, but that's not the vitality right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an essential part of what we were talking about earlier in terms of following the thread or tuning towards what's most important. It's also those cycles of like, okay, I'm just gonna pause and see what really wants to come next, and not just be carried along by the momentum of what got me to this point. And I think that's a really important. I think many of us, myself included, have faced that in the pandemic with things and structures shifted and different sensibilities and all of that. But I mean, and this is where work with Francis Weller has been so helpful, just to really see the pervasiveness of our culture of ascension and more money and higher, and always finding the most important thing, even that, like that.
Totally.
There can be the sense of always on task. And you also talk about in the book of the value in the creative process of hitting a writing block, or feeling like the painting isn't done, and like that leaving it and going for a walk is also an important piece. And
what's coming to me now, and this is sort of interesting analogy, but the like expanded definition of making love. Let's say you have a partner, and if making love is only relegated to however many minutes or hours you spend in between the sheets in intercourse, which can be really wonderful, but it's then like the rest of the time isn't that, but like that sort of beautiful question of how making love shows up to where it never really stops, not in some cute way, but, or how does it show up as this? How is it bringing itself to this? And maybe similarly, right? There's like, I was painting and now I'm putting the painting down and now I'm going for a walk and I'll come back to the painting. Like, that's true. There's an obvious face level way that's true. But also there's sort of, like the vitality was doing this and now it's doing this seamlessly. And then it'll come back to that. And I don't know. I think talking about this stuff too much can start to feel a little, kind of paint a floaty, airheaded image where you're like, I have no idea what's about to. I'm like, that may be true, and I've got my best guess along with everybody else. But to where there are these less, I was being creative and now I'm not, and now I'm gonna feel bad about myself because I didn't do this and da 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 da. But just bringing your, not just, but the way we bring our attention to whatever this is, feels like the heart of it for me.
Yeah, well, I know, like for myself in the writing process, there are many things that are necessary that aren't just sitting down and writing. It's the walk, in nature solo, where the ideas start to percolate, and things that don't feel like writing, that are actually the soil out of which something will come.
Totally. That's a great, just very concrete way of putting that. Yeah. I found the same. Yeah. I hadn't, just back to your original question about how this book came about, right? I had no idea. And it was really, I won't say forced, but a very firm container of time for me, just everything continuously falling away, because I had a million ideas about the next class I was going to teach. But they would sort of come and go and not return.
Yeah.
I'd kind of have to turn around and be like, are you still there? Like, come on, we're going to plan something. And meanwhile, something else was kind of just showing up of its own accord, like a weed, or just some plant in nature that just, it likes the soil here. I didn't have to plant it.
Yeah.
It's here.
Yeah. And almost like you described in the beginning, the shift with parenting of like, oh, you're not going to do all these things. You're going to tend this being that needs your consistent care right now. And how beautiful that your book emerged from that. I'd love, Liam, for you to read your land acknowledgement that you start the book with. And then I would just be interested in talking a little bit about your process with that.
Great. That's I'd love to. I've definitely had some feelings about this since. Let me find it. The very first page. Okay. This is true for where I sit in this recording. This book was written on the land of the Pacific Northwest, near where the Nooksack River meets the sea. Thank you to the life here in its many forms, the slugs, cedars, stones, hawks, mycelium, and giant firs, who are in this book as much as what I've ever learned in a class. I want to acknowledge the people who have stewarded this land since long before the arrival of white settlers, the Coast Salish people, particularly the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe. Much of this land was taken violently from these tribes, a truth I was largely shielded from viscerally experiencing as a child in school. May we tell this story as it is and honor the wisdom that is alive in these and other indigenous cultures, not only because it is kind and sane to turn back towards someone you've wounded and say, I'm sorry, how can I help make this right? But also because we are in desperate need of different frameworks about who we are and what the world is in this time of great social and ecological crisis.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
What kind of feelings have you had about that since?
Maybe I'll say, yeah, the spark of it. I can't even quite remember but it just seemed like suddenly I was like, oh, right. Where am I? That needed to be part of the book. First, thinking about the natural environment, and then maybe that fish in water, something I definitely did not see right away, but sort of felt into. And I spent a long time feeling into how to acknowledge the people who, in the like intensity, the intensity of the violence that happened here. And I don't know, so many of the particulars, but the like, yeah, there's just feeling to me, how we can like love land. Like you may or may not have had this experience, you, Carl, but also just you, listener, but of like, call it erotic or whatever, but like this, love of the earth that when it's being decimated, like fucking hurts, like if it was your best friend or your child. And the violence that happened to, people who had a whole culture around that kind of relationship to the earth, where two things were happening. One, this killing of the people, and two, this, kind of butchering and segmenting of the land and the waterways and putting in 90-degree angles. Finding a relationship to like speaking to that didn't feel like a show. That didn't. And I guess that's, to answer your question, some of the thoughts afterwards, I was like, oh, was this a little, because it can be like, I'm going to get on my soapbox now and say, hey, everybody, I'm feeling something, and here's what everyone needs to know. And, Resma, how do you say his last name? I know you guys have done some work with him.
Menachem
Said something like, don't worry about calling yourself an ally. Like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You don't need to call yourself anything. Like the people around you, especially, in this case, like folks of color around you, they'll tell you if you're an ally or not. And it won't be some badge that you get to carry to the grave. It's just now. This is what you're doing now. And totally the kind of taking away the accolades or saviorship or whatever, not because you're bad, just because it doesn't fucking matter. So I may be straying a bit, but
no, it
you're
feels
wanting
like
to
you're right on track.
Yeah, support the like vitality, or not even support, express the vitality of the relationship that isn't just, oh, this is my house because I bought this house. The context, like if that's the word, I'm in a much larger story that involves a lot of course, a lot of pain and suffering. And there's ways in which it's in the past, like that's obviously real true. And there's ways in which not just as a thought, but is alive and well, and asking for I'll just speak for myself, asking for my attention.
Yeah. Appreciate the way you framed that. And I feel too that that's a big part for both Aaron and myself of our growing sense of embodiment is that that relational web that includes land and its history and the all the humans and non-humans and the violence that has existed, that exists, and sort of how do we hold that in a, not as a concept or not as a sort of virtue signaling or something, but as a felt piercing the heart experience.
Yeah, and at least in so many instances, find it's here. It's not a word, it's not a concept like that can probably chink the armor or is that the right word? Can kind of pierce the armor for a lot of us. Someone's like, hey, look at this. This is what happened, or this is what you're doing. That can be that disorientation that sort of loosens our walls a little bit. And I also find a lot like, not even as some deeply out there act, but just like putting one's hands on the ground or going on a walk, and both the resplendent beauty of nature and this suffering, and like so much, it's all just, it's here. What else do you say about it? And yeah, to kind of steep in that like tea, because it's the most painful thing I can imagine turning towards. And where else am I? I'm already here. I'm already in a dance with that. So it feels in some ways just so deeply relieving to acknowledge, just in the same way an apology can feel so
Exactly.
relieving, like, fuck, I'm sorry. Like
Yeah.
when that comes from a real place of like, it's such a gift to them, whoever they are, and to me saying it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a line I'm often reminded of from Gene Gendlin, who's founded the focusing method, that embodied self-inquiry. And he said that we can handle the truth, finding the truth of a situation, because on so many levels our bodies are already experiencing it. And just like you said, like that, there's something our body knows about the land and our situation and what's happening with the climate, just like animals know how to run away from a tsunami. And acknowledging it is often more of a, in my experience, sense of relief of like, oh, that's in there, and bringing a different light to it.
God, that's a very powerful way of putting that. It resonates with me a lot. And maybe, I'm just thinking too, back to, whatever sort of practice we're doing, whether we call it a creative practice or an embodied practice, or, but something that may appear and may be, no one else is going to answer this for you, may be completely frivolous, but even something that may appear like, how is doing this painting helping the world? Do you feel what it's like to ask that question? Do you feel what your orientation is when you're asking, like, well, is this helping? Like, where is all your energy with that? For me, it's sort of like goes up and out, or all of a sudden I'm somewhere else. Instead of like, if the answer is obvious, then do the obvious thing. Don't do the painting, or do it. But also how it can really be a practice in like aliveness, tending to the aliveness, which this moment looks like painting, and the next moment may look like deep, sobbing, days of sobbing grief because of something that you never even knew, or maybe still don't even have an image for, but metabolizing grief or fierce anger, or, who knows? But this sort of aliveness practice, which is really the aliveness performance all in one, that can be one thread in that's a little less, here you are doing some fun art stuff, and then you're getting serious and doing your activism. And I know there's lots of people out there who are bringing this forward, this sort of pleasure, joy-centered activism in like really beautiful ways. So that's cool. That's heartening to me.
Right. And just how much it's necessary as a ballast to have beauty and pleasure and satisfaction and enoughness, and cultivate those and deepen them in whatever way possible, to be able to do the heavy lifting that we're all really called and are going to be called to do.
Yeah. And it's a deep conversation, or as I'm also often surprised and very struck by ways in which the thing that I thought was the heavy lifting is also so full of energy and so full of vitality. And like, I would need to resource with joy because over there is all the grief shit, but when you really go into the center of the grief thing, it's like, just sobbing or whatever. And it's like, I'm so happy. I feel so alive and just not at odds. To me, that's like if you have a knife that you want to like stick into my heart, it's just about being at odds. Like, here's life and you don't like it, and you're isolated. Isolated, right? The exact opposite of that ecosystem. Like, you're some schmuck who needs to go meditate in a cave, or needs to go do this, needs to enlighten, needs to do this before you're home. Before you're home.
Yeah. That's
and then you got shit to do at home. You got chores, like, but you're in this family.
Yeah. That's beautiful. So I know we're coming toward the end of our time. Any aspirations or words you'd like to share with listeners to close?
Right. I know we didn't read really much of the book, but I do, hope folks check it out. If they're feeling compelled, and maybe actually, I was like, do I really want to just end with a pitch? but this is a great example of sort of started speaking because it felt alive, and then I'm like, oh, kind of what feels like the real thing is just maybe a nudge towards unabashedly seeking out friends, seeking out things that feel good and nurturing, and like, I can't, I spent all of my money on therapy in my early 30s for about 5 years. I could not afford it, and I did it, and just every session was like worth its weight in gold. It was just so obvious to me how massively transformative it was each time. And so those things, like whatever it is, whether it's a book or a program or start a walk with friends, or this can all get so cliche, but maybe back to our, like, where's that thread of aliveness, and not, maybe not only not being afraid, but just that willingness. Like, because what a thing to say, like, I need you. Like, I need you. I need help. And I love, maybe, it's for many of us, I think for me, it was for so long kind of this lost art of prayer. Because that signals that I'm not enough, and I know that I am enough because I'm God. I'm the it's like, what do you? That's all somebody else's words. The truth of it is, I too just, like, that reverence, that prayer, finding continuously the humility of finding that is, maybe that's just a sweet little nudge for whoever's listening.
Yeah, beautiful. Prayer, and that we need each other, for sure.
Yeah. And I guess, not to yammer on about this for too long, but, and like everything, feeling what ways that's true for you, because that can, in my experience, it's just, those are worlds apart. And you might even go through some massive realization and say the exact same words in 10 years, but it's like, to know them from the different place, like, oh, like, we need each other. So it's like, yeah, okay, I know I need to do this because that maybe embodied is a great word here, right? That embodied desire. Where's that? What's that doing right now?
Cool. Liam, thank you so much. As usual, it's wonderful to spend time with you.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, I really appreciate you and our friendship we've developed over the years, however sort of sparse communication, but for real, I've really appreciated you as a dad, getting to check in with you a little bit, and as a husband, and I consider you a friend out there, so I appreciate that a lot. And to you and Aaron for doing the show. It's been really nice to listen. I'll just say, I think I said this in a comment, but I want to, like, just name it here on the show too. I'm only 40, but I do appreciate, I feel like I appreciate the amount of elders you bring in on the as guests on the show, and just like time and space to kind of not be so bullet pointed, and like kind of steep in that, to me is pretty rad, and something that I feel sad at how much I've lost touch with that, even in my own family. And actively right now, I'm sort of reaching back out, and kind of that pining for just the kind of thing that can only happen over 60, 70, 80 years, right? Even if you've been totally asleep at the wheel and it's like your body's been here a long time. Let's just hang out. So I love that you, it seems like you both revere and highlight that in the show. I appreciate that.
We need each other, and we certainly need our elders.
Yeah, totally.
All right.
And the young people.
Yeah, and the young
people. We need y'all.
Yeah.
And you babies.
Yeah. All right. Take care, my friend.
Much respect. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.